everyone, Stefan here. So this one's going to be a bit different in that I wanted to do some hard surface modeling for a change to kind of cleanse my palette from all the sculpting I've been doing lately. And I'm still going to show you my whole hard surface workflow for this one, which by the way is the reason I came to Blender in the first place. And I'm also giving this model away to you guys on Gumroad for you to play around with or study it if you want to model it and follow along with this video. So head on over there and grab it for free. And here's the reason I chose to model this. I actually really want to buy this guitar, but if you're anything like me and are actually terrible at playing the guitar, so you can't justify the expense of buying a new one in front of your significant other, so you want to do the next best thing instead, then this is just the video for you. Also, there's useful hard surface modeling tips throughout, so I hope you'll appreciate this. There'll be more character stuff after this, I promise. And poly modeling skills are just as important if you want to do character work anyway. This will be more of an intermediate level video, but stay tuned, I'll be making beginner videos as well. Now, I've mentioned before that add-ons play a big role in my poly modeling workflow, so I'll be using some of them here, including a few more obscure ones which I love and you may not know about, but I'll also try to include notes on how to do everything without the add-ons as well. And I'll put links in the description for all of them. So let's get started. Firstly, we need to drag in our reference images. You can drag them straight into the viewport. And you'll notice I've color corrected them so the background isn't perfectly white. That just would have made it really hard to see anything on top of it. And for this kind of shape, I like to start with a single vertex. In order to have this, you need to turn on the extra objects add-on, which comes standard with Blender. And then I just extrude it to outline the body of the guitar. And because the bottom half of the body is symmetrical, I split those points, duplicated them, and then scaled them to -1. And then just continue extruding the whole thing, being careful to use as few polygons as possible, because it'll make our lives a lot easier once this is extruded and we're doing poly modeling operations to it. And you can see, even though this is just edges, I've already added a subdivision modifier so I can see where this mesh is going to end up in terms of shape. And then once that's done, we extrude it and then get rid of the subdivision modifier so we can start poly modeling. Next, I use fill to cap the top of the body, and then I connected those two vertices to make the edge of the top cut out. And now here I'm going to use the mesh machine add-on real quick. This feature is called flatten. It flattens a face based on any 3 vertices connected to that face. And I've needed this feature so many times in the years before I switched to Blender. It's awesome. And mesh machine can do a ton of different awesome things like this. I'm barely gonna scratch the surface of it in this video. And for these cuts, I'm using another great add-on called Half Knife, which just adds cuts in a super fast and intuitive way. Next, I selected the top faces and inset them with edge rail turned on so the edge of the cutout stays in the same place. And then I did the same on the bottom of the body as well. Next, I did just a little bit of cleanup using vertex slide here with Shift V so the whole thing stays flat, and just a few cuts here and there to make it a little bit tidier. Although honestly, this doesn't matter. It's a flat face and all the adjacent faces are also flat. You could cut anything you like in there and you can still subdivide it and it'll look great. Next up, we add a bevel to the top and bottom edges, and I saw in my references that here at the front it gets sharper. So I'm using Mesh Machine again to change the width of the bevel while respecting the adjacent faces, and then the fuse feature to round them out a bit. And now the same thing for these sharper edges here at the front. And next up is just some more poly modeling to shape these cutouts a little bit better. Cutting in some supporting edges here for the bottom cutout, using Half Knife again to just cut with a single click. And a little bit of cleanup just so it's a bit tidier. Next up, I made a really quick approximation of the neck to use as a boolean to cut into the body. And there's a few ways to clean this up, but because it's perfectly straight, I decided to just add a few more cuts, because I think this was the simplest way to do it. You can see I don't even need to see the subdivided geometry. As long as the surrounding edges are lined up with the boolean mesh, we can get a perfectly clean looking result even after subdivision. But if you have a suggestion on how to do this more efficiently, I'd love to hear it out. Except I know like CAD modeling can probably do this the most efficiently, but I've never used CAD modeling software. Plasticity looks nice though, maybe I'll try it out. Still, as you can see, this isn't taking a lot of effort either. And again, the topology doesn't need to be perfectly clean in the flat parts. As long as it subdivides well and looks good, there's really no point in doing anything more than that. And this whole bed here where the neck of the guitar is going to go is also going to be completely obscured, so this is probably even a lot more effort than I should be doing. But there it is, I guess. We know it's there. And then after this was done, I selected one face from each side and pressed Shift L to select linked flat faces, and then Alt E and extrude the long face normals just a tiny bit to make the whole thing a little bit more rounded without adding any more topology. After that, I started the neck of the guitar using a box and then extruding outwards. Although you can see it has this interesting shape right at the heel of the neck just before it joins the body of the guitar. And for the headstock, I started with a single vert again. Why don't I have a shortcut for that? At least you can see where it is in the menu. Anyway, then I just extrude the whole thing again. And you can see it has this rounded sharp edge at the bottom end, where it goes from the blocky shape of the headstock to the C shape of the neck of the guitar. And also in that area, I wanted the vertices to be lined up in the y-axis. As you can see from the side view, it has this slope going down. So we're gonna need that geometry to be straight. So we cap those faces and then we can start modeling that slope. Just gonna need a few more of those straight cuts as well. And by the way, you'll see sometimes when I'm adding a loop, I will be using the default loop cut tool. You know, the one that gives you that yellow preview. But actually, most of the time I prefer using a different one, which gives you a green preview like this. This one's called Fast Loop and it's inspired by Max's Swift Loop, which I find is a bit more efficient in that it lets you cut a loop with one click instead of two. And it also places your loop exactly where your mouse cursor is, not at the middle and then make you slide it into place. And it's also free, so I definitely recommend it. Anyway, we just rounded out that C shape of the neck of the guitar and now connecting it to the headstock, and you'll notice a lot of the time for this sort of operation, I'll be using machine tools as Smart Vert and Smart Edge, which can do a ton of different very useful things, and they're also free on Gumroad, so you should totally get them. So I'm closing that hole in between the neck and the headstock while keeping the topology nice and clean for that rounded edge at the bottom. And there we go. After some final tweaks, I add a subdivision modifier and then shape the headstock into place. And I also added edge creasing with Shift E to make the edge as sharp as it should be. And after that, edge creasing again along the entire neck of the guitar to get the edges nice and sharp. Although I did tweak them to not be too sharp because, you know, this has to be playable. So yeah, definitely easier to do it with edge creasing rather than support loops in this instance. Now just adding the curvature of the fretboard and then some more edge creasing for the heel of the neck at the bottom. And then there's this part at the end of the fretboard which protrudes a little bit from the neck. And here the headstock does need some supporting edges as well, because otherwise with just edge creasing you see it shades really badly because of the smooth normals across such weirdly shaped faces after subdivision. But the supporting edges fix all that. And then some support cuts so the center of each face is inside the face, which is again very important for subdivision. This extra cut at the top isn't really necessary at all, but it doesn't hurt either. So there we go, has nice and clean shading now. And after this was done, I just duplicated that geometry and moved it down to the bottom side by pressing Ctrl for vertex snapping so it goes exactly in place. And I also had auto weld turned on at the top right. And then I also pressed Shift N to fix the normals because they were facing up and these ones need to be facing down. And that's pretty much it for the headstock. Then I just made a few final tweaks to the edge creasing and then the heel of the neck. And after that I was ready to move on to the frets. Which again I decided to start out from a single vert. So I just shaped the profile of it and extruded it out. And you can see frets have this sharp bit visible at the bottom where they dig into the fretboard. And then next there's many different ways you could do this, but I chose to add a lattice through hard ops. And hard ops and box cutter are awesome and I use them a lot. And they can also do a ton more great things that I'm not really showing much of in this video. But I'm sure you already knew all about them and Mesh Machine anyway. They're two of the most popular Blender add-ons for a very good reason, and they were also a big part of why I came to Blender in the first place. Anyway, you just saw me duplicate and place the frets according to the reference, and then I tried adjusting their width altogether using a lattice again, but that didn't quite work out precisely, so I scaled them manually in the end. Then I moved on to the pickguard, which I started out with a single vert again. It's the exact same process, and because this is perfectly flat again, it'll be very easy to make using this technique. After I was done with the shape, I extruded it out and added a subdivision modifier, and then just collapsed it straight away and removed the extra edge loops. Then fill the whole thing and look at the top and inset the entire face, and then at the end just add a little bevel, so it's not perfectly sharp, and then hard up sharpen to give it the correct shading. Next up we have the volume and tone pots, which is just a cylinder with the correct number of sides, so those ridges at the top are roughly the correct number. So I inset them all as individual faces and then scaled them inwards on the X and Y axes by pressing Shift Z, and then just made the top face flat and also beveled it a little bit, and then just duplicated it as an instance using Alt D instead of Shift D. Next up are the pickups, which are pretty simple, but I did make these as a subdividable mesh, unlike the pots. And here I'll be using loop tools, which is an add-on which comes standard with Blender, but isn't enabled by default. And I'll be using this feature here to turn my selection into a circle, which I've mapped to Alt Shift D. This is pretty essential in my opinion. I don't know why it's not enabled by default. Come to think of it, I probably should have just went ahead and made it with all the sides it needed, and then just used box cutter to cut an array of cylinders into it, but this obviously works fine as well. You can see I made one circle and then just duplicated it around so I get the same shape in each position, and then using edge creasing again to sharpen those bevels. That's what that pink highlight is, by the way. And you may have noticed sometimes I also very quickly mirror my object to the other side. That's another awesome Mesh Machine feature called Symmetrize, which basically just applies a mirror modifier without having to leave edit mode. And now this is the hard ops array model, which again just saves a lot of time doing an array. So next up we have what's called the bridge of the guitar. This is a relatively simple flat piece of metal with a 90-degree bend on one end and also some circular holes. This view is a bit confusing because it's orthographic and it's at an angle, but these are still circles. I used this view because I needed these circles to be lined up with the other ones, and then I just used Symmetrize again to mirror the whole thing. Now you'll notice every time I do a circle like this, I also inset it a bit so I get a supporting edge loop as well. This is important because it's necessary to have all the faces adjacent to the hole be the same shape and size so it looks correct once it's subdivided and smooth shaded. And you can see I've also given this mesh a solidify modifier and then a subdivision surface on top. Otherwise it's just a single-sided mesh. And after some final tweaks to the edge creasing, we're ready to move on to the plate for the 1/4 inch jack. And for this one I decided to do it straight with the rotation. It's important to rotate it in object mode, not in edit mode. And then we could just do every transformation in local coordinates, which you can see is the setting at the top middle of the viewport. So you can see my transformation axes are constrained to the rotation of the object. So once this part was inset and extruded inwards, first I added some edge creasing over there at the far end of it, and then I placed the 3D cursor over there on that vertex using the machine tools pie menu with Shift S, and then using the 3D cursor as a pivot, I scaled the whole thing towards it. And for the pivot and coordinate system options, I'm also using the machine tools pie menus, but the default controls for this are over there on the top, right above the middle of the viewport. Now just using vertex slide to angle this a little bit more so it's the correct shape. It should be like a 45-degree angle or so. And at the end I just tidy this up a little bit so that face isn't too narrow, which would make it a little bit sharper than it should be. After that I applied a solidify modifier using hard ops again, which is just awesome in how quick it is to apply and control. And a subdivision modifier to round it out. Now using box cutter for this cutout in the pick guard. Again, it's super quick and easy to do, even adding a bevel as well. And this is obviously not even the tip of the iceberg of what box cutter can do. So next up we have what's called the string saddles. This is just a strip of metal which is bent in a few places. So again, we'll be making this one with a single plane and then the solidify modifier and a subdivision modifier. And it has this oblong shaped hole in the middle, which is where the string feeds through from the bottom of the guitar. And it also has these stubby hex screws which go through it. They're used to adjust the height of the saddle, and thus the height of the string above the fretboard. Now next we're gonna cheat a little bit, because these screws are never gonna be seen from like extreme close-ups or something. Instead of taking the time to give them a proper spiral thread, I just gave them a bunch of loop cuts, and then I used another awesome machine tools feature, which is edge constrained rotation. This is super useful and it's something I really missed from 3ds Max when I came to Blender, and so I'm very thankful that this was added as a feature to machine tools. But I should point out that this isn't included in the free version of it, it's part of the Deus Ex extension. So yeah, you saw I just beveled those edges and then extruded them inwards along normals with Alt-E, and from a distance nobody would ever be able to tell. I do it this way because it's fast. And you can see it's the same thing for this screw as well. And these screws are also supported with like a little spring, which I used hard ops to make. You can see it's very easy to adjust. When you press control, you get these control points, and they let you tweak all the parameters on the fly. And again, we don't need to be like super precise for this because this is such a tiny detail. If I were going to be doing like extreme close-up macro shots, that'll be a different story. And now moving the saddles a little bit like they would be moved on a real guitar. Again, these are used to adjust the height of the strings and also the length or intonation of them. And now just making the head of the screws real quick. Again, at this scale, I'm really not stressing out over it. Just doing the first kind of quick topology that comes to my mind. There's cleaner ways to do this if you want to be perfect, but at this size, it really doesn't matter. So then we can duplicate this, and here I'm using a hard ops array again. And then duplicate it some more using Alt-D. Actually, I'm using Shift-D, but I really should be using Alt-D. And then just rotate each one a bit so they're not all oriented the same way. And the ones on the pickguard are just a little bit flatter, so I scaled them down a bit. Now moving over to the hole for the truss rod, which is at the headstock. Started with a single vert again, but you notice I was careful to line them up with the existing edges. And I was using snap to face over there at the top so it snaps to the headstock. And then after insetting it, I used Shift V to slide the vertices for the hole without disturbing the overall shape. And then just did a little bit of cleanup because I don't want the faces to be this skewed. And then just extrude it inwards and scale it to 0 in the y-axis. And then just a bit of edge creasing at the end. And now the machine heads for the string tuners. I'm not sure, in my reference this kind of looks like a continuous shape rather than a washer and a nut on top, but I might be wrong. So yeah, this is just extruded out of a hexagonal cylinder with a bevel on the hex part and then some edge creasing on the top. And for the hole in this string post, I'm using loop tools again to turn it into a circle. I am still showing the whole thing. I keep doing this because you guys seem to like it, but do let me know if you get tired of it. I didn't think this one was going to turn out this long again, but there it is. So yeah, now I'm doing this boxy part of the tuner at the bottom side of the headstock. It's a bit more rounded in terms of shape. And then after that, we can add the key itself to the tuner. And then again using hard up, solidify and mesh machine symmetrize. And then finally some edge creasing, shade smoothing, and that's pretty much it. And now an array through hard ups. And you'll notice I did this whole thing on a duplicate of my reference where I've rotated it so it's straight and now I'm moving it back to the other one. And by the way, whenever you see me align anything with Alt A, I'm once again using the machine tools version of it. It's way better and it's also part of the free version. And now we just have a few more relatively simple bits and pieces left to model. I'll go over them as quickly as possible. This is the pickup selector switch, and I'm only making the exterior without any mechanics. Now here at the dot inlays, I used Smart Fill to fill those circles with quad faces, and then a shrink wrap modifier so they conform to the surface of the fretboard. And then the same thing for the dots on the side. Now this is a neck plate which is used to bolt the neck to the body of the guitar. It's just a plane with some bevels and circle insets. And this is the back plate which covers the trem block. Again, I'm only making this as an exterior model, so there'll only be an indication of what's inside. Because you can see it has this little hole which you can see through that I made using box cutter real quick. And then box cutter again to cut out this space which is underneath the back plate. This is where the trem block is, and there are these springs which normally hold it in place, but I won't be making those. Only a very rough indication of the trem block itself. And now the nut of the guitar. It has little cutouts for each string, which I'm making one by one because they're all a different width. Alt E and extrude the long face normals. And then delete these little side faces so I could fill the whole thing with a single face, and then inset it, added a bevel modifier using hard ups, and that's it. And next I took this base part of the machine head which we made earlier and used it as a base for the 1/4 inch input jack. And then used machine tools again to place the cursor over there, and then again to align it to the cursor. And now this is the strap button where you would attach your guitar strap. It's just a cylinder with some extrusions and then a bevel modifier. There's one that goes at the back of the guitar and then another one which goes on one of the horns. And it also has a screw which attaches it to the body of the guitar. And next up is the tremolo arm, aka the whammy bar. For this sort of thing I also like to start with a single vert, and then after I added some bevels, I used another one of my favorite hard ops features, which is curve extract, which very quickly creates a curve from your selection and lets you adjust it as well. And now this is the plastic end of the handle, and then again I use machine to align the cursor to the handle and then the mesh to the cursor. And then with the transformation pivot set to active element, which took me a couple of tries for some reason, I just rotated the handle a little bit down. And so the last thing left is the strings themselves. Again, we're starting from a single vertex which is extruded all the way to the end of the fretboard, through its slot in the nut, and then to the tuning post. And you'll notice it doesn't go straight through the tuning post, because it needs to be wound around it a couple of times first. And to do this I made a new single vertex, and then applied a screw modifier to it. So then when you move it away from its pivot point, we get this spiral, which is exactly what we need. So then let's just move it into place and then adjust the number of windings. We'll come back to this after we set up the other strings. Now let's give these bevels some nice corners using Ctrl-Shift-B when we're dealing with just vertices. And then I used hard ups again to turn this into a curve, which I can easily control the thickness of. And then I duplicated the vertices from this first string and reused it for all the other ones, with the exception that the last couple of strings need to go below that string tree on the headstock. And then again curves from hard ups, and then also using it again to adjust the thickness of each one. And now back at the string windings, we're applying that screw modifier and then extruding the end so we can feed it through the hole once more to give it a little bit of a curve once it goes out the other side, as well as a nice little bevel. Now let's use hard ups to turn it into a curve with the correct thickness. And then I selected those two parts and pressed Ctrl A and then G to turn the curves into geometry. And now Ctrl J to merge those two into a single object. After that we can select the two open borders and press F to use Smart Fill to bridge the gap between the two, and then Smart Fill again to close off the other end. And I also like to twist it a little bit so it looks like it's been cut like a real string. It's exactly the same for all the other ones, so no point in showing them. So that's the modeling pretty much done, and we can finally move on to shading and rendering. For this we'll be going into material preview mode, which is located up here in the top right. And I also like to turn on ambient occlusion and bloom from the render settings because it looks nice. The material setup isn't terribly complicated here, it's mostly just plastic and metal, and if you'd like to you could slow this down and look at the settings I'm using specifically. So there's this yellow one for the body with some clear coat, a chrome one which is gonna go on most of the metal pieces, this white plastic one for the pickguard and the other white plastic pieces, this black one for the dot inlays. I especially like how nice the tuning keys look as soon as you apply the chrome material. Added another couple of loops to add this black material to the side of the pickguard, another slightly rougher metal material for the other metal parts. Now for the wooden material for the neck of the guitar, I got this one from AmbientCG. I'll also include a link in the description for it. I did tweak it a little bit in Blender, so here's a quick breakdown of what I did. You'll notice the mapping is set to generated, so it's not using UVs but rather mapped in world space. A little bit of scaling to fit the neck. The image itself is set to box mapping with a little bit of blending. Couple of color correction nodes. Same thing for the roughness map. And the displacement map I'm only using as a bump with very light settings, because overall this is supposed to be very smooth. And that's pretty much it for the wood material. Next I made a very simple texture for the volume and tone pots. And here I've hidden some faces with Shift H, so I can easily select and map each of the numbers. I scaled all the other faces down and put them in the corner because they're just flat white color. And then I used this black and white texture as a mask to mix the light and dark color. And I also used it for bump on this material. Now for this next part we'll need to turn on import images as planes and then add images as planes. So now we can add our decals which have alpha channels, so we don't see the entire image but just the text. And now here's a quick tip that might save you a headache or two. Do you notice how one of these decals looks like garbage and the other one is alright? They're actually both the same resolution except one of them is a pre-multiplied PNG and the other one is a fully colored TGA texture with an actual alpha channel. And this is the one you want to use because Blender will actually treat the transparent pixels of the PNG texture as white and only then apply the alpha blending over that, but it will never look perfect due to something called MIP mapping. That's a long story, never mind that. Just make sure to always have an actual background color to your decals that blends with them and let the alpha channel do its thing. Now, as you may know, the top 3 strings of a guitar are wound, so to achieve that we're gonna need to do some mapping and texturing. First I selected the ends of the string by using the select sharp edges function, and then one of the edge loops that go along the entire string. So then we can mark them as a seam and unwrap the whole thing, and for this effect we'll be using a wave texture, which you can see once we reduce the scale it looks almost perfect except at the ends where it's clearly not mapped to the object. So that's why we want some actual UVs. And we did unwrap them earlier, but we also need to straighten them out, and for this I'm using Text Tools, which is a great free add-on, which adds a lot of needed functionality. And now the wave texture is mapped the way it should be. But we don't want it to just be a flat color, so we're also adding it as a bump and then adjust it a bit until it looks good. And the same thing is done to the other 2 strings as well. So that's the shading and texturing done. Now let's try it out real quick. Oh, just needs a bit of tuning, hold on. There we go. Plays great, you guys, go try it out. Anyway, let's set this up for a final render. So first thing I did was group everything using Machine Tools as Deus Ex, so I could easily move and position the entire guitar with all its objects. And then you can see I created a very simple studio backdrop from a cylinder. I also created a camera and pressed Ctrl Alt Numpad 0 to position it where my view is. And now this next add-on is pretty new and doesn't seem to be very popular yet, but boy am I happy I got this one. It's called Light Wrangler, and what it does is let you add and position lights by just hovering your mouse over where you want that light to shine on your model. And it also lets you adjust them on the fly as well. I mean, look how easy this is. I used to absolutely hate doing this before. The whole setting up a different viewport and then trying to position your lights while looking at the other one, and then it's never quite right because you don't have direct control. So I'm very happily never doing that again thanks to this add-on. It's an absolute game changer for me. This whole lighting setup took like 5 minutes and it looks exactly how I wanted it. It also gives you some nice features like feathering the edges of your light so it looks like a studio softbox, as well as giving it a tilt or changing the light temperature or adding gobbles. It's just great all around. This is why I love Blender. You get all these awesome tools available to you, and yeah, I had to spend money to buy all of them over the years, even a bunch I didn't even end up using. And of course you don't need them to make great art with Blender. It can still do that just fine. This should go without saying, but if you're a beginner I wouldn't recommend spending a bunch of money on add-ons before you've learned Blender's default features. But as a professional I just love finding new ways to improve my efficiency, as well as my quality of life when dealing with these everyday tasks. Anyway, this turned out way longer than I initially intended, but I do try to make these as helpful as possible by showing the whole thing and including useful tips whenever I can, so I do hope I've succeeded in that, because it's a lot of work. So anyway, don't forget to grab this guitar on Gumroad for free, and I'd love to see what kind of cool renders of it you can come up with. So at me or something, I don't know how that works. So this is all for now. See you in the next one.